We often think that aging well requires dramatic changes, new routines, new identities, or a complete lifestyle overhaul. But what if the most powerful transformation comes not from doing more, but from starting smaller? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies that help us live longer, healthier, and more purposeful lives. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In this episode, we're talking about transformative aging, using the SPIES model: spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. We'll explore how small, intentional actions in each area can compound into profound, lasting change. This is not about perfection or balance alone. It's about steady growth toward a more integrated, meaningful life. About aging well.
Dr. Armstrong, when you use the term transformative aging, what do you mean? And how is that different from simply aging well?
Well, I don't know that it's really different. I think it's a more advanced way of looking at aging well. And part of it is because this podcast has evolved a bit over the 4 years, now into the 5th season. We have gone from really looking at aging well from a much more physical standpoint to really diving deeper into the well-centered fitness approach, applying the SPIES model, and really looking at how comparatively, as we look at other aging podcasts, as we look at this kind of surgence of longevity influencers and things like that out there, I think it really emphasizes that aging isn't transactional. It's not about taking supplements. It's not just simply about living longer. It's about growth, mindset, learning to be more vital, and really living with purpose. And so the idea of transformative aging is to really underscore the fact that aging is not a period of decline. It's a period of just different growth. It's another stage of life. And technically, it's really not even another stage of life because we're aging from the moment we're born. But it's looking at the lifespan as a growth opportunity as opposed to just a transaction.
Okay, well, why do so many people struggle with lifestyle changes as they age, even though they know what they should be doing?
Well, I think some of it is the fact that, you just said, should be doing. People don't want to necessarily do. I don't think we struggle with putting the effort into growth and bettering ourselves. It's a lot easier to look for biohacks, to look for the latest supplement, the latest shortcut to slowing our aging process or making ourselves look like we're not aging. And so I think a lot of people struggle with lifestyle change as they age because, for one, we don't prepare ourselves well enough for the stages of change. We also don't. We're also in a society that is highly ageist. I mean, the United States, in particular, has I'm trying to think of the right word with it, but they really tend to focus. We do tend to focus too much on youth, and we kind of disrespect aging. We look at aging as a disease. We look at aging as something to be avoided. We look at anti-aging. It's all these things that make people want to avoid aging, and so they want to, they want to not age, but they don't want to do the things that they need to do to age. And exercise is hard. We know that exercise gets in the way of, life gets in the way of our exercise is what I really mean to say there. Right. And as well, we don't sleep as well. Just our society is built toward everything that slows the aging or speeds the aging process. And so everybody is looking for the way to avoid that without doing the things that they need to do to be able to really themselves slow the aging process. And again, by slowing the aging process, I mean by slowing the rate of potential decline, not the fact that we're going to age fast. We're still putting 8 years on the clock, if that makes sense.
Yeah. In your opinion, do you think the fear of getting older, that's all it is? It's just a fear because maybe it's subconsciously we're so used to having this young youthfulness, and so we have the idea of having the youthfulness, and when we see the previous generations before us and we see that, hey, they don't have the abilities to do what I do, and so we're making that comparison, but it's just a like it's just our own perception of how aging is. Is that kind of what you're talking about? You know how you said,
I got
so sorry.
Go ahead. I'm getting a little bit lost in what you're saying, but
Well, you say as as a society, we kind of focus so much on youth, but we're not focusing so much on aging. Do you think that comes from a fear of having limited abilities to do stuff, or where it's not entirely true? Because as we're aging, we can actually age for the better.
well, I'm totally lost in that. To be honest with you, I think what you're saying is what I'm saying is that this society, it paints a picture for us for what aging is. You look on the media, you look on ads in magazines and things like that. The elderly are always depicted as frail and declined,
Right.
and we don't get enough of the images of people. I was just talking with a guest yesterday and he mentioned about interviewing Jack LaLanne on several occasions and just how much vitality he has. We don't see those types of people as much in what the media tells us aging is all about. And so the fears that we have are kind of what we're seeing around us. We also see a declining health in this nation. We see an increase in Alzheimer's disease. So, of course, the more people you personally know and see who have Alzheimer's disease, who have osteoporosis, who are growing increasingly frail because of sarcopenia, who are growing increasingly obese and inactive. And we're seeing the less vital side of the aging population. And so, of course, we're going to think that that's what aging is all about. And likewise, we go to our physicians, and what's the physician say? Oh, you're just getting older. And so there's this picture painted in front of us that aging is just decline. And so if that's all you know, then of course you're going to think that that's how aging is supposed to be. And one of the reasons why we're stepping into this idea of transformative aging is to really educate our viewers and listeners that it doesn't have to be that way, that we can challenge the norms of aging. And normal is not optimal, and optimal is what we should be pursuing. And so what is optimal for aging well?
Cool. Changing the mindset, changing the perception. We're real trailblazers in this.
No, we're not trailblazers. It's just I think we're doing the right thing when it comes to, educating the population. We're not here per se to be influencers on the internet. I mean, that's not my goal. My goal is to really help people to age well. And, it's not about selling supplements. It's not about, getting more likes or, followers on social media. It's about really aging and helping people age well.
Well, one of the things that you talk about to help age well is actually baby steps. And you often emphasize baby steps a lot. Something about Bob. You even do it in your classes. So, why are small changes so powerful for long term transformation?
Well, I think they're essential for long-term change. It's like you can't run a marathon by bounding. You ever seen somebody run a marathon with long bounding strides? You're not going to be able to do it, right? It's just not effective. It's those, small steps are what are going to keep us successful, because we keep our stability. We're able to make small change. Small change lasts. We build on those. We stack, different habits that we're building. That's where change comes from. We talk more about habit stacking and baby steps because that's what brings big change. If I want to lose 20 pounds, which is kind of a goal of mine right now, so what am I going to do to lose 20 pounds by summer? It's pounds of fat. I don't want to lose bad weight. So I don't want to lose good weight, rather. How am I going about doing that? If it's take it 10 weeks to lose 20 pounds, that's 2 pounds a week. Okay, well, that's 7,000 kilocalories a week that I have to be in deficit in order to lose that weight. So how do I go about doing it? Well, add a little bit of exercise. One thing I've started doing at work is, my lab and my office are on the 3rd floor of the building. And so I think it's like 113 stairs or something, like steps up, from the ground floor all the way up to my office. And so I'm making a habit now, every time I use the restroom and between classes and every opportunity I have, just get up, walk down those stairs, walk back up. And, you do that 6, 8, 10 times a day, those calories begin to add up. And so that's one small change. If I just one day did an extra flight of stairs, and that multiplied by, I don't work 365 days a year, but say we multiply that by 365 days a year, that's a lot.
Right.
You can look at the effects of, how many calories if you switch from a sugared pop to a diet pop. Again, we want to go beyond that. We'd like to get to water, but that's a baby step. It's like, okay, just one less sugared pop. That's like 260 calories. Do that every day. That's a lot of calories over the course of a year. I think it adds up to roughly, this off the top of my head, but somebody can do the math and prove me wrong, but somewhere in the neighborhood of about 14 pounds over the year that we could lose just from that. And, then you make the step, okay, well, I've got down to where I'm drinking one less sugared pop a day. Now make it 2. Now let's stop drinking pop altogether. Let's start drinking healthier beverages, and just step by step. It's like if you go to your local coffee shop every day and you're getting a latte, and how many calories are in those? Okay, yeah. Well, maybe the first step is to go to a low-fat latte. Then you go to, something with sugar-free. And, you baby step your way toward success, and if it's getting to exercise, if you exercise, you've never exercised, even exercising one day a week is going to do something for you. Or, these exercise snacks throughout the day. So the list can go on in terms of the small changes we can make that are going to add up to becoming lifelong habits, that when we get into these habits of living healthy, then we see less disease, we see less fatigue, we see less impact of, life on the aging process. Let's pause for a moment to thank the affiliate partners who help support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored and no company pays for airtime here. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us keep producing thoughtful, evidence-informed content. One brand I genuinely trust is Oral Wellness, especially their Gluteral Plus, and copper peptide formulations. I've spent time vetting their science, their ingredient quality, and their transparency, and I personally use these products in my own wellness routine. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and exploring tools that may help you feel and function better, check out Oral Wellness in the show notes.
Do you think you can briefly explain the SPIES model and why it's such a useful framework for aging well?
I don't think so. I don't know anything about the SPIES model, so I don't think I can. No, of course, I will explain the SPIES model for our listeners, and hopefully people are listening to this podcast enough that they're hearing it. Okay, they're talking the SPIES model. I know what the SPIES model is. But if it's a new listener or viewer that has not heard what is the SPIES model. And hopefully, if you're looking at transcriptions, that they're actually spelling it correctly as SPIES. The SPIES model is really just a shortened form for what I've, for a long time, called just well-centered fitness. And it's been my approach to being well. And as I've gotten older, it's kind of evolved into aging well. And the SPIES model is just something that my friend Jay had identified, that he noticed that when I talk about well-centered fitness, I always say it in the order of SPIES, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social well-being. And I've never been intentional in doing it for an acronym, but it's fortunate that it kind of makes a nice, easy acronym. But to me, the spiritual, physical are the base and the most important aspects of wellness, that we get those first, and then we build off of that with the intellectual, the emotional, and the social. And so the SPIES model is just a way of looking at overall wellness and considering, in this case, the five-dimension component of wellness. So spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social.
Okay, but how does focusing on all five dimensions help prevent the stagnation that comes from a routine-based living?
Well, I think it's not so much just the five dimensions themselves. It's focusing in on the five dimensions as a goal, as a pathway that we're trying to manage in life. And I generally talk in terms of an asymptote, that we're trying to approach this asymptote of well-centeredness, this balance in our lives among those five different dimensions. And by focusing on the five different dimensions, I don't know, it necessarily prevents us from getting into a routine, but when we focus on those five dimensions as a growth mindset, as something we're pursuing perfection in over time, then that gets us out of that routine. Because if we're in a routine, whether you look at, from a spiritual standpoint, and we define spiritual wellness as, a belief that there is something greater than self. So focusing more other-centered as opposed to just focusing on self. A component of that for many will be their religious belief system. So if you go to church or to synagogue only once a week, or I should say mosque as well, whatever faith you are, you go the weekly service, and that's all you do, and it's a routine. It's just like, oh, it's Sunday, got to get up, go to church. You go to church and you go home and you watch football. That's routine. That isn't a growth mindset. It's not going with that intention of, how am I going to come home from this a better person today? And so when we focus on the five dimensions as a growth mindset, then we're going to prevent stagnation, because we're always trying, what am I doing better today that I didn't do yesterday?
Well, let's dive deeper on that a little bit. In the spiritual dimension, what are some simple but practical steps listeners can take to cultivate purpose and meaning as they age?
Well, I think really probably the most important first step in cultivating purpose and meaning is a daily practice of journaling, meditation, self-reflection. However you want to go about doing that, just doing something on a daily basis to look at, how am I interacting with the universe, my community, the world around me? What am I doing to contribute? And why am I here? What purpose do I have today? What am I trying to do to become extraordinary in whatever my ordinary life is? And by extraordinary, I always put parentheses around extra, because, we tend to think that extraordinary has to be, a superstar athlete or a celebrity or something like that. But you can have the most menial type of job, but you can approach that with a mentality that I am going to be the best insert career that anybody could be in this particular field, and have tremendous impact. I mean, you think of just even somebody who's bagging your groceries. giving a smile and, being polite to somebody that's coming through and just taking extra care in how you put their products in the bag is meaningful. And it may have an impact on that person that they walk out and they live differently. And so that would be one simple step, is just, look at, okay, well, where do I need to change? Where can I be a better person? I think another really simple step that we can take is to follow Dr. Rob Kelly's advice of nice sneakers. He said on his episode with me in We Have a Spiritual Problem that he could change someone's life with just 2 words: nice sneakers. And, somebody walks by you and you just kind of smile at them and say, hey, nice sneakers. And you look at, a corner of your eye as they're walking away, you can see them kind of look down at those sneakers and, probably got a little different posture to them, maybe a little bit more energy in their step. And that they're going to, interact with the next person they see more positively. They might treat their spouse differently, or, treat their coworkers differently, because they've received that one compliment. And so just looking for small, little, simple things that we can do on a daily basis. You've heard that phrase, random act of kindness. It's like doing something nice for somebody, just holding a door. It always bothers me that people get annoyed when you open doors, but a lot of women, well, I can open a door myself. It's like, well, no kidding, you can open the door yourself, but it's me expressing respect to you in opening that door. And I always get a little bit of charge out of, when, see people, as you're walking to a door at the same time as them and they almost like hurry themselves to get that door for you. That to me is a reflection of, okay, this person sees me as somebody that they respect, whether they know me or not. And, bothers me when I walk through a door and, you walk in behind somebody and they don't even bother to kind of hold the door open just a little bit longer so that it doesn't close on you. And that door like kind of closes on your face. And it's like, thanks, dude. I really appreciate that. And so from a spiritual dimension is what are the simple things that you can do to make this a better world? And to make things a better world, we don't have to be going out solving the, politics problems or global warming or the energy crises or, solve the any economic issues. It's not big problems that we have to solve. It's just, how do we make one life just a little bit better today?
Right.
Is going to have a huge effect if we're all doing it.
Yeah, that's good. Wow. Hey, how does spiritual well-being influence motivation and resilience into other SPIES dimension?
Well, again, I think the spiritual is foundational, because if we understand that we are not the center of the universe, that we have a purpose, then we start to act in ways to fulfill that purpose. And, the first area, is physical. And we look at physical health and, how we're taking care of ourselves so that we can take care of others. If we don't take care of ourselves, we can't do much to help others. But if we're only focused on our own self, then that isn't healthy either. And, it feeds into, your intellectual builds off of that. I like to kind of think of these as a pyramid where the spiritual and the physical are the base. And I think that we're seeing this kind of evolution of humanity where the spiritual and the physical are blending together. And, you can't separate the two, but you can separate the two. And we look at things from a physical standpoint alone. You can look at how infinitely small the universe is as you get down to, physicists are finding smaller and smaller divides of the material world. And at some point we get to, well, what's in between all of that? And what is this energy that's driving, the physical? And then you look at the spiritual, and then you also look at the universe getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so we are part of something so infinitely small and something so infinitely big, and we're all interconnected. Physically, we're made up of mostly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and a bunch of other minerals. But if we breathe out CO2 and breathe in oxygen, where is that oxygen coming from? Where is that CO2 going? Somebody else is going to be breathing in the air that we breathe. The oxygen that we get is coming from the trees. They get the CO2. There's so much interconnection just on a physical level. But then you look at that from a spiritual, we're all interconnected. And that importance of understanding how we operate within the universe as collectively one. And you can get really deep into the spiritual aspects of that, and people are going to not necessarily have the same views. And that's why I think it's important to, from a spiritual standpoint, disconnect ourselves a little bit from our religious beliefs and allow ourselves to understand that spiritual is much bigger than just our religion, and that our religion is really just giving us a glimpse of what is that spiritualness of the universe. And then you start looking at the intellectual piece. Well, starting to understand better, how does my body work? What is the universe? What is the spiritual piece? And then our emotional, I always feel, is like the keystone of the five, that it kind of locks in together that intersection between the spiritual, physical, intellectual, and the spiritual or the social. And then social kind of is how then are we bringing all this together to affect the lives of other people. And our social interactions always then, of course, feed back into the physical and the spiritual and so on. And so they're all intertwined. And, the spiritual piece, I think, is what drives it, that sense of purpose, sense of greater belonging, that there is something greater than self. And for some, that may not be a God. For me personally, it is a God. But, it's just that understanding. And when we step into that understanding that there's something bigger than self, then we make huge bounds towards healing society, healing the world, and solving our world problems.
Well, since they're so intertwined, the spiritual with the physical, when it comes to physical wellness, people often feel all overwhelmed, right? So, where should they start with exercise, nutrition, and sleep?
I'd say, again, and this is where it goes back to that journaling as being really the first piece, and that self-evaluation. Well, where am I in my physical wellness? And just take one aspect of that wellness, and what can I improve to make myself healthier today? And it might be exercise, it could be nutrition, could be sleep, it could be baby steps in each one of those different areas. And so the first thing, if it's about exercise, how much exercise are you doing? You're doing none? Then do something. Just start walking. And it might only be, I'm going to park my car 10 spaces further away than I normally do when I go to work. And that's going to give you 20 extra, well, whatever the distance of those 10 spaces are, it's going to give you 2 times that more activity for the day. So, okay, that's one small step. Maybe then I can do something else tomorrow. If I am already exercising, well, how can I refine my exercising to be more beneficial? Maybe I'm going to the gym regularly, but I'm not really, we did a recent episode on periodization. I'm just kind of I'm going through the flow. I'm just doing the same thing over and over again. Well, what can I change that will have a positive impact on my physical health? Maybe, I've been lifting a lot of weights, but haven't done any cardio. Maybe I need to do a little cardio, or maybe I've been doing a lot of cardio and haven't done any weights. Or look at your flexibility. I'm a little bit tight in this area. What can I do to improve on that? And it's just one small little change every time we're working out. I mean, the whole idea of progressive overload as a principle of adaptation is, stepping into these baby steps of improving our physical well-being. If I lift this much weight today and I do a little bit more the next workout, then that's growth. That's pushing me in the right direction. And it's not making dramatic changes. It's just small incremental changes day after day after day. If it's nutrition, what can I change? What can I subtract from my diet that's unhealthy? What can I substitute that with? What can I add that's going to make me healthier? And then sleep. What's one small thing I can do tonight to get a better night's sleep? Maybe it's, I've been, staying up watching TV before bed. Well, I'm just going to stop watching TV for half hour before, bedtime. Or maybe it's even just establishing a bedtime. So, okay, this week I'm going to get to bed by 10 o'clock every night and do that. So it's just one small change that you can make that's going to have an impact on your physical wellness.
I'm reminded, as you're describing this, I'm reminded of the artist, pretty famous artist right now, known by Jelly Roll. He was over 500 pounds, and he's recently lost like 300 plus pounds. And he started off just parking the car a little further away when he'd go places, and then he just started walking in, and then he started walking around the neighborhood, and then he'd start finding hills in his neighborhood. He'd start walking up the hills, then he'd start going on trails, and then once he started losing weight, then he was able to go to the gym, and he started lifting, and he started doing like events through his gym to kind of keep him motivated. And then he cut like sugars and processed food out of his diet, and the weight just started. But he started with just bare minimum, like, I got to do that. It's just a baby step. And he started moving forward, baby step, baby step. And for him to lose over 300 pounds, that's a huge feat. That's a victory, in my opinion. And that's awesome. So, I mean, yeah, as you were telling that story, just kind of reminded me of Jelly Roll and how he started off small, and what started off small ended up being a big difference in his life.
And it doesn't have to be that big of a dramatic change. I mean, somebody doesn't have to lose 300 pounds. It might be, just simply being more active or gaining a little bit of muscle strength. And so we don't have to see that, we have big changes to make, but the bigger the change we have to make, the more baby steps it's going to take to get to where we have to go.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. So, what is a realistic baby step approach to physical activity look like for someone in midlife or adulthood? And I know you already answered it previously with providing that awesome example of the stairs for you, but are there any other examples that you can come up with?
I mean, how much time do we want this episode to be? I mean, you just gave a perfect example with Jelly Roll. I mean, every example is going to be individualized. And so, the baby step approach is just what change are you trying to make? Where are you trying to get to? And then what are the steps you need to get there? It's all about just recognizing what needs to change, and then what's the first thing that we can do to improve that. And, when we talk about midlife or later adulthood, that's when a lot of people have gone through a period of life where they've allowed themselves to get out of shape. I mean, Jelly Roll was not born at 500 pounds.
No.
He had to do things that got him up to 500 pounds, and that took years to do. And so an important thing to understand is we didn't get to where we are overnight. You don't gain 300 pounds in a night. It takes years to do that. And so it's going to take years to reverse the ill effects of our lifestyle. And so we got to recognize that it takes patience. It's going to take numerous steps. There are no shortcuts. I think that's one of the most important things to understand is that, a baby step approach isn't like, okay, well, I'm going to start taking GLP-1 this week, and then, I'm going to take metformin, start adding metformin in the following week, and then I'm going to get liposuction. And, it's not the shortcuts. It's finding the steps to get to the routes that are going to get you where you need to be in a sustainable fashion. And so that's what the baby step approach is. It doesn't matter where you are in life. It's just figure out where you are, how you got there, where do you want to go next, and how do you do it. If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
How does sleep and recovery fit into transformative aging, and why are they often overlooked?
Well, I think first off, we're always looking for the shortcut first. And so, we look at what we can take as a supplement or a biohack in order to get there. But ultimately, to get to a better spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social well-being, we need to take action. And action takes adaptation. And adaptation takes time, and it takes recovery. And so sleep and, general recovery, it's, I think, a little bit easier to kind of see that in terms of the physical dimension of the SPIES model. That if I work out and I, do lifting sessions 3 days a week, the sleep is going to help me to recover from those, because the body recovers during sleep. If it's active, we're still metabolizing things. We're still, using muscles, and the list goes on. We need time for the body to become restored and replenish itself from that exercise. And so sleep, whether we're talking intellectual or even from an emotional standpoint, or from a spiritual standpoint, meditation, if we're thinking, positively and trying to focus on positive things throughout the day, when we get into sleep, our sleep is going to be much more focused on positive things. If we are so focused on the negative, and one of the worst things that we can do before bed is to watch the daily news, because you're going to just be exposed to all the crap that's going on in the world. And you're going to go to bed and you're just going to be lamenting over all of that, as opposed to if we can focus on something more uplifting, then we're focused on the positivity as we sleep. And recovery is an essential part of, we have to have time in order to adapt. So we need to stimulate, but we also need to recover. And recovery is going to be, from a physical standpoint, it's going to be nutrition, again, adding sleep into that, not doing activities that are causing load on the body. We need to have the things that are going to bring, the restoration to the body, the hypertrophy, restoring, muscle glycogen, the list goes on and on and on. We can go in a whole physiology lecture in terms of recovery and sleep and what it does. But across the board, we need, sleep just for the mind to get its restorative processes in there. We need time to recover, even from an intellectual standpoint. You can look at, if I'm studying for an exam, I can't stay up all night and cram and expect to do well on that test. I need time for my brain to be able to process the information, recover, restore that, and, organize the information to be able to recall it. And so sleep and recovery fit into transformative aging, because, if you're transforming, You're initiating change, and in order for that change to occur, there has to be adaptation. And in order for adaptation to occur, there has to be adequate sleep and recovery practices.
Also, it truly is underrated. Like having a bedtime and prioritizing it, and the benefits of sleep are just like you said, they are just phenomenal and completely overlooked. And we as a society really need to focus on our sleep hygiene. Yeah, it's just sleep is so critical. I just cannot get over how critical it is. And I look back at my younger self and I'm like, man, I wasted so much time like staying up late or pushing myself and burning the wick at both ends of the candle. And it's like, if I could have just gone to bed, everything would have been significantly better. So, well, life lesson
But you
learned.
can't look back. You just, what can you do today to change? So
Exactly. Exactly. Well, okay, and that's a perfect segue into our next question. So, how can continued learning and curiosity support cognitive health and a sense of vitality as we age?
I think we're hearing more and more the importance of keeping an active mind in order to minimize the risk of all forms of dementia. But just having greater vitality, just having an interest in the world, that awe and that desire to just learn and to engage in the world around us gives us a greater sense of vitality. I mean, there's a greater sense of purpose when you see that there's so much more to observe and to experience in life, and that curiosity just helps the brain keep processing and want more information. The less we allow ourselves to continue to learn and to be curious, the more likely that our brain is just going to become more stagnant, and we'll see more cognitive and neuro decline. Let's take a brief pause to recognize one of the affiliate partners that helps support the Aging Well podcast. We are not sponsored and we never accept paid placement. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps to keep the show going. One company I've personally vetted and trust is Jigsaw Health, particularly their high-quality magnesium and electrolyte products. They also offer the Root Cause Protocol packages developed by Morley Robbins, who joined us on an earlier episode of the podcast. I appreciate Jigsaw's transparency, testing, and thoughtful formulations, and I use the products myself. If you'd like to support the show and explore Jigsaw Health or the Root Cause Protocol for your own wellness journey, check out the link in the show notes.
Well, what are some ways people can engage their intellect daily without feeling like they need formal education or major time commitments?
It's really just committing some time. It doesn't have to be a lot. Maybe it's read a book, 30 minutes a day. Could be, a worthwhile contribution to, engaging your intellect. It could be just the choices that you make in terms of how do you spend your downtime. What TV programs are you watching? If you are watching TV, are you watching something that is engaging your brain, or is it just mindless nonsense? And sometimes that mindless nonsense is okay. I mean, I'm not saying that you always have to be watching, National Geographic or something like that, and you shouldn't be watching Comedy Central because it's just unhealthy for you. Sometimes humor can engage the brain as well.
Right.
And, so it's really just having a sense of curiosity and seeking to, engage that curiosity, try to learn something new, pick up a book that is on a content that you are not familiar with and try and learn something from it. And, it doesn't have to be a lot of time, a few minutes a day here or there. Obviously, you don't necessarily need a formal education. Just learn by finding more information. I've been a big fan of Teilhard de Chardin for some time, and I talk often about him. And I was having a conversation with my son who's taking some courses in philosophy and, going some pretty impressive routes. I mean, I talked to him and it's like, dude, you're getting way too smart for me now. Talking about Thomas Aquinas and, just relating some of what he's learning about his philosophy and his theology. And it reminded me a lot of Teilhard's approach to humanity. And he kind of made a comment that it sounds like Teilhard is, and he didn't say it this way, but I took it as he's kind of saying that, Teilhard's thought process was derived from Aquinas. And I'm like, I don't think that's the case. And so got on to Amazon and ordered a Kindle book that is about the two people and comparing their thoughts. And so I'm reading that now. So it's just, something engages your mind or something triggers a question, look it up. And we have the opportunity in this society now to, if a question pops in your mind, you can pull out your phone and get an answer to that. So why not, look that up and, expand your brain a little bit, and so it doesn't take formal education, doesn't even take much time commitment. It could be as much as Googling a thing or two here and there. But I would also make the point that when you do Google something or you're getting something from the internet, you're watching a YouTube video, you're watching this podcast, don't just take our word for things.
Right.
Go to more original sources. I just mentioned Thomas Aquinas and, Teilhard de Chardin. If you're sitting there saying, well, who are these guys? Don't let it just slip your mind. Oh, I don't know who these guys are. So, oh, well, maybe hit pause here and go on to Google and look them up and say, hey, I'm interested in knowing more about this person. Let me find a book and let me read it. Or maybe, you can watch a YouTube video. But again, question the information that you're getting, the sources, but explore the questions that you have in your brain is one of the easiest ways that we can daily engage our intellect.
The more you know, because knowledge is power.
Yeah. Well, the more you know, the more you realize how little you do know.
That's
so
true.
That's what helps you really engage the brain.
Right. Hey, here's a question for you. Now, I know we've kind of come a long ways as a society as far as emotional health goes, but emotional health, it could be argued that it is often neglected. What are some small practices that help people better regulate stress, negativity, and emotional fatigue?
I'm kind of questioning how you're thinking that the society has come a long way in terms of emotional health. I think we've slipped off the cliff. I mean, I don't think we're near as emotionally well anymore in society as we have been in the past. But there are small practices. I mean, we're horribly stressed. I mean, we just bring stress on ourselves. And, we are far more negative as a society. I mean, just look at, again, the news or go on social media and see how people banter back and forth and the lack of emotional well-being and emotional IQ people have anymore. And so some small practices are just, okay, what can I do to regulate stress? Breathing techniques, again, going back to sleep, getting that healthy sleep is going to help manage our stress levels. How do we interact with other people? If somebody, and I hate that the phrase, oh, trigger, you triggered me. Well, trigger is to me a sign of poor emotional health. That if you're being triggered, you're not able to interact with people who don't agree with you. And that fuels our negativity. And the more negative we become, the more fatigue we get with our emotions, because we just allow stress to get the better of us. We allow conflict to overtake us. And so sometimes I think some of the small practices we need to take are just, okay, I'm just going to take a few breaths here and I'm going to allow myself to think about what this person said and, I'm just going to let it go. I think, a great practice that I've started doing lately, it's been a while and I don't do it near as well as I should, but I keep a little water bottle in my car. And if something's stressing me out, I'll just kind of spray a mist and say Haval. And Haval is the word that is translated in Ecclesiastes in the Bible in the Old Testament of like meaningless or mist. It's just, everything is meaningless. And it's like, this is insignificant in the scope of the entire universe. It's like, it's not a big deal. Just let it go. I used to, joke with when Frozen was so popular with my young daughter at the time. It's like, whenever you'd be, somebody be getting bothered about something, it's just you start singing, "Let it go, let it go." And I know I just offended everybody by singing on this podcast, but there's just different things that we can do. I remember my stepmom, to my dad a lot of times, if he'd start ranting about something, she'd be just, let it go, let it go. Just kind of let it go. Just try and have that mindset of, if something is bothering us, just how can I disengage from it? And again, it's small steps. So it's like, okay, well, where are you struggling with stress, negativity, or emotional fatigue? What is one thing that you can do to alleviate that some? And everything is going to be individualized. So I can't sit here and give a whole list of, here's the 10 steps you need to take to emotional well-being. It's what are the 10 steps, or what's the first step that you need to take in order to improve your well-being?
I would say one of the steps is to be emotionally aware. You got to be aware of it, which kind of transitions into my next question. How does emotional awareness support long term behavioral changes and personal growth?
Well, I think you just said it. Emotional awareness, when you're aware of the issue, then you're constantly making steps in order to change that behavior. And, if you're making steps to change behavior, you're growing. And so personal growth is just baby steps. You can't grow without some level of recognition. And if you go back to like the transcendental model of behavioral change, where it's pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance, those are the kind of steps. You're not going to make any change if you're not aware. The first thing you have to do is be aware that there needs to be a change. And it might be, finally dawns on you that everything your spouse has been telling you has been bothering them is kind of your fault. Or, there's change that you can make, or there's your contribution to the issue. And say, okay, now I'm aware that this is a problem. Do I want to change? And hopefully you make the quick decision that, yeah, I need to change for the better. And so now what do I do to change? And you're looking at, okay, what do I need to do to change myself? And then you take the step and change, and that hopefully is a very quick process. You become aware, accept the awareness, and, decide on what you have to do and do it. And then just keep doing it.
All right. Well, what about social connections? Because social connection is one of the most strongest predictors of healthy aging. So, what would you say a simple step people can take to strengthen this area in their lives?
Well, I think, the first simple step is to recognize that we have two ears and one mouth. I love that phrase. So listen first and before we speak. And, if we do that and try and understand that what is the common ground between us? What is the goal that we're trying to accomplish?
That's good.
And I think in many cases, and this was Dr. Greg Stewart appeared on it's been twice on We Have a Spiritual Problem podcast. And he presented that idea that, what we all have common goals. And oftentimes we have different approaches to how we want to accomplish that goal. And that's where the conflict comes in. And so if we look at, okay, well, what are we both after here? And where can we begin to compromise in order to accomplish that particular goal? That's going to go a long way in terms of helping to build our social relations. I think just making time, to be, being present with other people. And being present isn't necessarily being in the same room. It's actually taking the time to actually listen and to hear to somebody. And again, going back to 2 ears, 1 mouth. One of my favorite steps that I've taken in my own life with my wife is at one point, I don't know, a number of years ago, I suggested that we set aside 15 minutes every day for what I call a 15-minute check-in. So we sit down, try and do it every day, and it gets kind of disappointing and frustrating when we can't. If somebody has meetings or something like that, we can't get that small 15-minute window to check in. But just sitting down, saying, okay, we're going to give ourselves 15 minutes, talk about our days, find out what's going on with one another, and just taking that moment to just breathe and relax and spend time together. And, of course, now the kids kind of engage in that as well. My daughter has long, argued that you say it's 15-minute check-in, but it always turns out to be 45 or more. And, so giving that time to them as well. I mean, I've seen, okay, I've done this with my wife, but am I doing it with my daughter? And am I spending time, am I actually listening to them, or am I kind of just trying to do what I'm doing and pretend that I'm listening? So it's, what can I do? I just need to stop what I'm doing right now and give them a few minutes to speak and to hear what they're saying. And you're still going to get stuff done, but,
Right.
They're going to feel better about it. And so, social connection, there's so many little things that we can do. Put down the phone. I get so agitated in teaching my classes that anytime we take a break, everybody's got their phone out in front of them. And, I've taught before phones and before cell phones, not before phones. I'm not going back all the way to, Graham Bell. But, when I first started teaching and there were no cell phones, you'd come into class, you'd have to kind of settle people down and get them to stop talking so that you can start the class. And now everybody's on their phone and it's so quiet in the room. It's like, okay, well, everybody put your phones away now and let's get started. And, so what are the things that are keeping you disengaged from the people around you? And just what's one small little thing that you can do to increase that engagement?
That is great advice. That really is. That being present thing. I think whoever's listening to this and they want to take on that practice as a part of their life. I really think you just gave advice to mend and fix any relationship, friendship, coworkers, spouse, children, like whatever it is. You just being present in those moments. I think that is phenomenal advice. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, and it's advice that I give to myself that I don't always listen to.
Right.
So anybody listening to this and, or listening to this podcast and thinking that, wow, yeah, Dr. Armstrong's really got his shit together and he does all this stuff. I don't. The reason I, come up with more and more of these ideas are trying to fix myself and the problems that I create, and so, these are things that we're working on as well. And, that's why I treat it as an asymptote that, we make progress over time, but the more we make the progress, the more we realize really how little progress we've made. And we just keep moving closer and closer to that asymptote. And the closer we get to it, the more we realize that we're farther away from it. And, so sometimes we can think we got the best social connectedness and realize, well, no, not really. You might hang out with a bunch of people, but you don't even know your friends very well. And you start making those steps to get to know people better and be more present. Then you realize how little presence you've really provided.
Right.
And, you have to change and keep going.
Oh, speaking of changing, how do you help people move from isolation or surface level connection towards purposeful social connectedness?
Again, you asked that question like I actually do this well. I think from a general sense, we want to move people from isolation or more surface level connection is beginning by being more vulnerable ourselves. The more we expose ourselves to others, socially, not in a inappropriate fashion,
Right.
the more we reveal ourselves and get deeper with people, the more willing people are going to be willing to trust us and reveal themselves.
Mm.
And sometimes I think one of the first things that we can do is ask people a question, "How are you doing?" and mean it. A lot of times in our society, we walk by, "Hey, how you doing?" And they turn like they're going to start answering, and like, "Oh shit, they're going to actually answer me." I don't really care how you're doing. It's just a phrase that we use, right? We should be very intentional in how we interact with people and say, "No, really, you don't look like you're doing too well. What's going on?" And being willing to listen, just taking a few minutes to get past that that surface level connection and really be intentional and like, I want to know this person.
Right.
How can I get deeper in this relationship and not just be superficial?
I think you just gave me an idea for another podcast episode. Maybe we can do because I was thinking sometimes you ask people questions and perhaps they have a diagnosis of autism, and those surface level questions don't necessarily necessarily resonate with them per se. And so having that deeper social connection, when maybe we can do an episode on aging well with autism. That's really interesting. I think we got one of our next topics. That would be really cool.
Well, I don't think either of us are knowledgeable enough in autism, but if we have somebody out there listening to this podcast that is an expert in the area, we'd certainly love to bring you on to see how we can interact with people and it's not just autism. I mean, any kind of emotional, physical,
Right.
spiritual, social challenge that somebody has is going to interfere with our ability to interact well with them. And it could be PTSD. It could be, one recent guest we talked about the invisible warrior and the idea of, how we interact with people who have chronic diseases that, they don't necessarily communicate, or sometimes we think, oh, they seem fine, but they're really not because they don't expose kind of what's going on with them. And autism, again, being a spectrum, which is, a long range of different levels, I personally think when people say they're on the spectrum, I think we're all on a spectrum
Right.
of autism. I think we all have certain, issues that make it a little bit more difficult for us to interact with other people. And so, yeah, I'd love to have a professional on and dive into that a little bit more deeply.
Getting back on track, how do these SPIES dimensions work together to create momentum towards transformative aging?
Again, I think, is we look at this as an asymptote, as something that we are striving toward. Success always breeds success. You hear the phrase success begets success. That as we take a small step and we're successful in that success is going to lead us to want to take the next step. And, sometimes, it's not just focusing in on the one dimension. If we focus on all 5 dimensions more or less simultaneously, those successes in one area is going to feed into another area. If I take a step in terms of understanding first spiritually that I am not the center of the universe, then how I interact with the next person I interact with is going to be more like, well, okay, they have something to contribute. So how am I going to interact with them in a way that is going to be more spiritual? And that spiritual connection then leads to you being more socially engaged with that person, and maybe with that person, then, you've learned something about them that you don't know much about. So it's like, okay, well, I'm going to study that. I'm going to learn more about, that particular topic. And, how we engage in our physical well-being, are we doing it for ourselves or are we doing it for other people? And the more we start recognizing that my health and my well-being is important, not just for me, but for everyone that I'm being interacting with, it's going to feed into those other areas. And so the whole idea of wellness and well-centeredness is that all of those feed in together. And if we're growing in one, it's going to feed into the others. And the more we focus on all 5 dimensions, the more they're going to interact with one another. And it's going to propel us closer and closer to that asymptote.
So, if listeners could take home just one small step this week to live more well centered, what would you encourage them to start with?
I think I'd go back to journaling and, just taking a period of time in the morning, get yourself a notebook. I go through countless composition notebooks. I got to figure out where I'm going to store some of them because I've gotten to a point now where I've stacked them all up is just running out of space. But just, pull out a journal and, write some of your thoughts down in the morning, but look at each of those 5 dimensions of the SPIES model. And it's like, start by just setting a goal in each of those 5. What can I do today to be more spiritually well-centered, more physically well-centered, more intellectually well-centered, emotionally well-centered, socially well-centered? And then at the end of the day, maybe take a moment of time and just, how did I do? Okay, well, I didn't do too great today. Big deal. Tomorrow's another day. What can I do differently? And so just one small step is to just simply be focused on transformation. What am I doing to transform myself today? And just take small steps. And it doesn't have to be, 5 steps, one in each of the dimensions. I think in a recent podcast, you talked about, kind of looking at this as a staircase. And we talked about how a staircase isn't really a good example because, it's just really one step at a time. And it also tends to lead us to think that there's a destination. And really what we're trying to do is bring ourselves in a direction that is going to help us grow overall. And that growth is going to feed the other areas. And so I would just say, take a moment, take a morning and evaluate yourself. Where do I feel my strongest? Where do I feel my weakest? And just take one aspect of that SPIES model and take some steps to improve on it.
Right. Well, if it's not a staircase and you're not just putting your foot in one area, you're putting your foot in multiple areas. How can viewers assess whether they're merely maintaining balance versus truly growing as they age?
Well, again, if you are reflecting and evaluating yourself on a daily basis, you're going to see, have I grown? Am I better today than I was yesterday? And if you're not, then you're not growing. And you're going to grow in some areas a little bit faster than other areas, and that's fine. So where am I growing? Where am I not growing? And understanding how we can manage that balance is going to be, critical. And so just evaluating yourself is really how you're going to assess whether you are just kind of maintaining balance or you're actually truly growing. If you're getting better, then you're going to see it. Physical, it's easy. I mean, it's very easy to monitor your physical well-being and see changes. Spiritual might be a little bit more difficult, but how you can see very palpable changes in how you're interacting with other people, how you're interacting with the world. How is your brain working? How am I responding to insert problem in the world? And how am I doing? And am I doing better? Am I reacting better today than I would have yesterday? Then you're growing. And so it's really, that assessment is going to come from just self-evaluation. There's no exam that you can take on spiritual wellness. I've yet to put together a spiritual quantification, and what's your SPIES quotient, so you take the test, and maybe that's something we can do and we can sell on this podcast, where you go to a website and you can take the SPIES quotient test and determine where you're balanced. It's not like a Myers-Briggs test where,
Right.
I'm an SES, I'm really out of shape physically and intellectually, but I'm really good spiritually, emotionally, and socially. It's a self-evaluation, and just kind of think of it as, how good am I doing in each of these areas? And, where am I seeing disproportionate amounts of growth or a disproportionate lack of growth? And then just go from there.
I guess to summarize today's episode, in order to see if you're truly having transformative aging, you need to understand the difference between living ordinarily and living extraordinarily. And the difference between ordinary and extraordinary is just that little extra. So if you're making forth that little bit of extra effort, say you're going on walks or walking up a stairway, or you're adding physical activity to your daily routine, or you're subtracting sugars or processed food, or you're adding extra hours of sleep, or you're adding reading, or you're adding journaling, or you're adding time to spend with a loved one that's saying, hey, I care about you and I want to hear how this conversation goes, whatever it is, it's not going to happen overnight. You got to put forth the effort. You got to have that purpose, and you got to move forward day by day, baby step by baby step. And if you can do all of this, then we know for a fact that you will age well.
And I think it's a critical thing in our society these days. We have to have this mindset. That it's not just about you and me aging well, it's about our society aging well as well. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.